This is one of the biggest, probably one of the most useful achievements of Jefferson's administration was the Corps of Discovery, because he wasn't expecting to actually have the land at the time. So it's important that we understand why he was so against doing it at first, why he was so against acquiring the Louisiana Purchase at first. He helped to write the Constitution, but he didn't actually write it. Alexander Hamilton wrote so much of it that he's actually called the father of the Constitution. The Constitution was written specifically to give powers to the federal government, okay? That was the purpose of the Constitution, to form a federal government and to outline its powers. Okay, the Bill of Rights was written as a way to take power away from the federal government and give it back to the people. Those amendments, that's why they exist. Yes. Say what? It's the same slide. Oh. It just has more words on it now. Okay. Okay, so the Bill of Rights was written to take powers away from the government, to make it so that while the government has the right to form a military, that military does not have the right to quarter itself in your house. While the government has the right to produce arms through that military does not have the right to take your arms away. The Bill of Rights took power away from the federal government and protected the rights of the individuals. And the reason the Bill of Rights is included in the Constitution is because Jefferson and others like him thought that the Constitution already had too much power. They never wanted to see the government, the federal government, have a great deal of power over their people. Jefferson is what's called a strict constitutionalist, meaning that if it's not in the Constitution, the president and the Congress shouldn't be able to do it. So that's as opposed to John Adams, who was a loose federal constitutionalist who believed that the Constitution left lots of room for interpretation. During the time that George Washington was president, he was tasked with the job of setting up the government, of interpreting it so that it would have a structure. So we don't get a whole lot of exercise of those powers because he's still developing. You know? During the time 1789 to 1797, when he's president, he gathers the cabinet, he establishes the military, but he doesn't define it, and he basically gets the country back on its feet after an extensive revolution. And we covered so much of this, and I'm going to skip past some of it. Let me get past this. In 1800, when the vote was really, really tight, overwhelmingly the country wanted those strict constitutionalists. They wanted that weak central government. That's why Jefferson and Burr tied, because they both represented the same party. But Jefferson won on the promise that he would leave the federal government not in charge of as much, that the states would retain their rights. That was the promise that he made. So I want us to take a look at North America in 1800. And this is the part of America that has been awarded to America after the Revolution. They've been given everything up to the Mississippi River, down to the northern border of Florida, and up to the southern border of Canada. This is what was agreed in the treaty by the French and the British and all of them. That's what they agreed on. This is what France owns. It's the territory of Louisiana. And this is New Spain, which is owned by the Spanish. Up here is what it was called contested lands, disputed lands. Nobody's quite sure who owns this land. Is it part of the Viceroyalty of New Spain, or is it part of the Louisiana Purchase? It's hard to say because nobody's actually charted it. And you can put on paper, we have everything up to wherever it hits the ocean again, but they haven't actually mapped it, so they don't really know what it is that they actually own. So this whole territory here is completely disputed, but there are British forces that border on it that could own it. There are Spanish forces that border on it that could own it. And there are French forces that could own it, okay? But it's disputed, and it's going to go to, it's going to go to whoever has feet on the ground, whoever manages to settle it first. When Jefferson decides that he needs to go above and beyond the powers of the presidency, it's not to achieve a big piece of land. It's because he is worried that with what's going on in France, that the Mississippi will no longer be accessible by the Americans. The British are supposed to leave their forts in the Ohio River Valley, but they haven't yet. They haven't evacuated those forts yet. And Jefferson and the rest of his administration are worried that if France loses their foothold here to the British that the British will control the entire river valley and that all of their gains they made during the revolution will go out. So he sends people specifically to negotiate for the purchase of New Orleans. He sends people with $10 million to offer to buy New Orleans so that they can have that port city, just that city, that's all they want. But Napoleon's in some financial trouble, and he doesn't have the troops that he needs to even guard this land, because honestly, this land is completely in the hands of natives. There's no French settlements. French weren't settling things very well anyway. They were mostly fur traders. So in order to establish any kind of control over this region, whatever resources it might have, he doesn't have the troops to actually have control over it, especially since he's decided to turn around and start invading the rest of Europe. Also down in Haiti, there's been a slave rebellion, which his own troops were not able to put down. So already his military presence is really weak. So when they send agents to buy New Orleans, just this port city down here, just New Orleans, for 10 million, he offers them all of this territory for 15 million. Jefferson realizes that what he's doing is doubling the size of America and doing it for only slightly more than he was going to pay for the city of New Orleans. He is deeply conflicted about this, but ultimately he decides that even as a strict constitutionalist, it's too good of a deal to pass up. So America purchases Louisiana and doubles its size. Now we just have to find out what's there. So Jefferson orders what's called the Corps of Discovery. The Corps of Discovery is going to be people whose job it is to travel across this new purchase and sort of chart it for its resources. They need to find out what animals it has, what plants it has, what natural resources it has, what bodies of water, what kind of soil, what kind of landscape. Just get across it and explore it. It's under Meriwether Lewis, who was Jefferson's former aide. It was his personal secretary. And William Clark, who was Meriwether Lewis's old commander. He invited him to be a part of this. And usually the two of them, Lewis is supposed to be in charge, but Clark was his old commander. So in a lot of cases, Clark takes charge of it, even though he's not supposed to. There are 47 people on this expedition, and most of them are just feet on the ground. Most of them are just assistants and aides and people, former Revolutionary veterans, people to just be explorers. But there are a couple of interesting people. William Clark brings his slave, York, who was with him on the battlefield in the Revolutionary War, who has been with him since he was a little boy. So he's never not had York by his side. So he comes. They bring in Toussaint Charbonneau, who is a French fur trapper, for his linguistic abilities, although they learn very quickly that he is not all he claimed to be. Linguistically speaking, he's not actually that talented. He's not very brave. He's scared of water. I mean, he's scared of being in boats. He's a big guy, and so they don't. But they consider his gifts valuable enough that they decide to bring him, even though he insists on the caveat that he be allowed to bring one of his wives. He has two women that he bought when they were little girls. They were captured Native Americans who'd been sold as slaves across the North Territory of North America from one tribe to another. And they have landed in Charbonneau, and Charbonneau has eventually started treating them as his wives, and this one is pregnant, and that's Sacagawea, who is pregnant with his child, and he insists that she be allowed to come. Meriwether Lewis and Clark agree to this because they think maybe her linguistic skills might also be valuable. So she's allowed to come even though she's pregnant. So there's a bunch of people on this expedition, but those are kind of the important ones. They have some pretty specific goals. They have to catalog the flora, fauna, zoology, and geology. It's important that they track what kind of animals are in this territory because there are going to be things that they haven't seen yet, and that's absolutely true. Cataloging the plants will make it possible for them to come up with new cash crops, maybe new timber, new forestry. They really do catalog quite a few animals that they've never seen before. There are different species of antelope and sheep, rams that they've never seen anywhere in the northern colonies. There are birds. They've never seen different kinds of foxes, rabbits, all kinds of furs that didn't exist in their consciousness that now will become really popular in Europe pretty quick. Beaver, for example, the amount of beaver that they find on their trails shows that the part that they were actually, like in upper New York State, the beaver trade there is nothing compared to what's available in the upper, Midwest. Probably the biggest thing that they see that impresses them the most is the roaming herds of buffalo, which go all the way up at this point, all the way up into like up into this area. Eventually, forces will drive the herds down south, and you'll run into most of them out here in the west. But at the moment, they see fields so covered with buffalo that they're just like, is there even a field here? So that's probably the most impressive thing that they see. They're also supposed to be finding natural resources. They're supposed to be cataloging what different kinds of soil there are. The biggest, anybody want to guess what the biggest natural resource they're looking for is? Nope. More precious than gold. No, it's not salt. Water. The most important thing that they need to find is fresh water, because the more sources of fresh water they find, the more settlements are possible. So the biggest natural resource that they're charting is where do these rivers go, and are those rivers freshwater or saltwater? So tracking the place where water is one of the most important things that they do. They are traveling as much as they can by river, but that's not why. But they are also tracking where fresh water goes and how it affects the soil. One of the things that they admit pretty early on in their journals is they don't actually know anything about minerals. Lewis and Clark are really clueless when it comes to rocks. So they just take samples of everything. So like there's a whole floor of a museum that's just rock samples that Lewis and Clark picked up. And because they didn't know what they were looking at. They knew that they were seeing things they'd never seen before. These white cliffs that they see, they know that those aren't like the white cliffs in England, and they don't know what makes them. They don't know why they're white cliffs, so they take a sample so that they can bring it back. I think it's quartz, but I don't really remember. But the biggest thing that they're looking for is water. They're looking for fresh springs, places where the water is pure, because those are going to be really great settlement areas later. But their biggest goal is to find a passage to China. Believe it or not, people still believe that you can get, that there's got to be a way that you can get on a boat in Hudson Bay and sail west and end up at China. There's got to be a way to do that. This land is not that complicated. There are big rivers throughout it. Surely there's a way. And at this point, they're aware. Do I have that here? Yes, I do. Okay, they're aware that there are mountains. Okay, they have a map in their mind, and this is kind of what their map looks like. They're aware, based on what the Spanish have said, that there's a peninsula, and that on one side of that peninsula are some mountains. But they envision this like spine of mountains. You know, like you go up and down and you're over the mountains. And there's got to be a river that goes through that, right? It's just a line of mountains. That's all it is. Right? I mean, that's totally logical. Maybe even they can find where the source of these rivers is, if they can find where they come down out of this one little tiny thin spine of mountains, which is what they're expecting. So when they approach the mountains, they're very excited because they're like, now we're gonna climb up to the top of this spine of mountains, and we're gonna look down, and there will be the ocean. And that's what they're expecting. And that way they will have found how to get through this, just a tiny little part without a boat, just to get over a tiny spine of mountains. So you can imagine their dismay when they get to the top of the peak, and what they actually see is more mountains. Mountains stretching as far as the eye can see. Has anybody here ever been to the Rockies? I've driven through them twice in my life. I've driven from California to Texas twice, and weirdly never the other way. I always fly and then drive, but to move people from Texas, from California to here, I'm one of those people that's bringing in those Californians into Texas. But anyway, the tiny part of the Rockies that I went through, we drove through the Rockies all day, and we never came down out of them. And I was in a car that was going arguably 80 miles an hour, okay? Because I don't like speed limits. So even though I was driving for I would say almost 11 hours straight, I never came down out of the mountains. Now you can imagine doing that on foot, okay? Carrying a caravan with you that included, by the way, a woman who had given birth by this point, so carried a small child. But when they got to the top of this mountain and realized that there was a endless vista of mountains in front of them, they realized they had no idea how far away the ocean was, that there was no way through it, that part of their expedition was just never going to work out. But they also realized that they were in some trouble because they'd left their winter camp behind them to go up into the mountains. They knew they couldn't make it back before winter. They knew that they couldn't make it before they ran out of warm weather. It was already freezing cold up in the mountains, and they had no idea whether to go forward or backward. So this is probably the moment at which this expedition ran into all of its biggest problems. They didn't have the supplies to deal with this. I mean, this was not what they had packed for. But they couldn't go back and make it back to the winter camp before winter really got hard. So they had to decide whether they were going to go forward and hope that somewhere in this big patch of mountains that there was friendly people that they could encamp with. All along this expedition, that's who they've been camping with. Their job has been to, one of their goals has been to make good relationships with the natives that they met along the way. They've introduced themselves. They've told the natives that they met, congratulations, you have a new great father of all the land, and there will be more of us coming. And that great father was, of course, Thomas Jefferson, whose picture they carried. And, you know, they're like, this guy is now in charge of you. And they're like, okay. But they would make camps, they would trade for goods, they would establish good relations. They had Sacagawea, who spoke 3 different Native American languages. And then they had Charbonneau, who spoke some, but wasn't as useful as they thought he was going to be. But they managed to make camp with people who told them they were crazy for trying to seek the ocean. They did, we've never seen the ocean. We don't even think there is one of those. And they said, no, it's on the other side of the mountains. Y'all have never been to the other side of these tiny little mountains? And they told them they were crazy. But their only hope is that as they progress, they will find more friendly people that actually live up in the mountains to take care of them. It is at this point in their expedition that they have probably the biggest coincidence in American history to ever happen. Because they do find themselves at wit's end, running out of supplies, starving, trapped in winter in the mountains, desperate, and they find their way into a Shoshone camp. Okay, so they set themselves up to negotiate with this Shoshone camp. Please take us to shelter and food. We will work out some way to make our gratitude known to you as soon as we get there. And the people that they met agreed to take them down into the camp. And as soon as they arrived at the camp, Sacagawea ran into the arms of the chief because it was her brother. It was the village that she had been stolen from when she was a child. So, biggest coincidence in American history, the camp that they find is actually the camp that Sacagawea's family is at. And her brother recognizes her and she recognizes him, and they embrace and they become great friends. As a result, Lewis and Clark's expedition is allowed to stay there for the winter, resupply, and is able to get intelligence about what it is that they're on the other side of the thing. You can get to the other side of the mountains. You can get to the ocean, but it's much farther than you guys think it is. You obviously have no idea how far you have to. It's so far away that we don't bother to do it most of the time. And also on the other side of the mountains, you will run into another tribal people. So that is a big goal that they have. Their 5th goal is to make native alliances. And it's as a result of Sacagawea that they're able to do it. It's important that we recognize, huh? Yes, her contributions under this are why you can find Sacagawea coins, because she was honored by the administration for her contribution to this expedition. They, on the other side, they meet what are called the Nez Perce, which is an interesting name, and I've always wondered exactly who gave it to them, but I'm not a Native American expert in any way, shape, or form. Nez Perce is a French phrase that means pierced nose. So they must have at some point came in contact with the French, but I don't know who actually gave them this name. But this is a unique people. The Nez Perce have not interacted with Spanish missionaries or British traders, or and have only rarely interacted with French traders and Russian traders. They have just the bare necessities to recognize, oh, you're those weird white looking people that we've seen once in a while. Other than that, they have no idea about the culture or the, so they don't have any idea that on the other side of the continent, there are hundreds of thousands of Europeans that are looking this way. And so all of their relationships with the Lewis and Clark expedition are very friendly. Actually, if you look at the history of the Native American West, and you have to look past where this class teaches, the Nez Perce are the ones who last the longest before Anglo-American forces wipe them out. They are the ones that hold on to their ground the longest because of their kindness to the Lewis and Clark expedition. They're the ones who get them to the ocean. All right, so Lewis and Clark make it all the way to the Pacific Ocean finally. It's much farther than they thought it was going to be. It's over much more interesting ground than they were expecting. It proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that there is no way to get from Hudson Bay to China in a boat. So they wiped that out once and for all. but they are also feet on the ground in this territory that's disputed. They can actually lay claim to it and say, we were here. This is us that were here. The Americans were here. They actually have charts and maps and documentation that shows that they entered this land, and they left clues to that effect everywhere they went. They nailed things to trees and buried rocks that were carved and all of that kind of stuff. So Americans now have put feet on the ground in this disputed territory. They turn around and they come back, and they decide to split up for about a month so that Lewis can explore the, I want to say the Marin River, but that might not be right. Let me look. Marias River. The Marias River. And Clark can explore the Yellowstone River. So they split up for about a month. And during the time that they're split up, they each run into native trouble. So for some reason, they didn't run into it anyway on the way up here, but when they split up, they each do. Lewis, Blackfeet try to steal Lewis's weapons. They come into the camp in the middle of the night and try to steal Lewis's weapons. And as a result, a couple of members of the Blackfoot tribe are killed, and that causes bad feelings for the locals, for these people. The Crow successfully managed to steal about half of Clark's horses. They raid into the camp and steal about half of his horses. So by the time they come back, they both had some trouble with various native tribes. And then they make their way back, all the way back, and they report their findings in St. Louis. So this is an incredibly successful expedition, all things considered. They have managed to form alliances. They've introduced the American people to the natives along the way. And now they've paved the way for American settlers to start moving in that direction. It's going to take time before people are actually moving into this area, but it's going to happen faster than anybody assumed. Jefferson is actually quoted as saying something to the effect of that there's so much land that America owns now that it will take 100 generations before we even see the other side of it. It was almost completely settled in less than 4 generations. In like 100 years, there were people from sea to sea. So it happens faster than people realize. It's also not the only expedition that's happening at the time. There's one more that goes out at almost exactly the same time, and that's Zebulon Pike. Poor Zebulon Pike. I feel bad for him. He seemed to get most of the assignments that he got because he pissed off his superior officers. Somebody has to go do this job that nobody wants to do. He gets to go do it because his superior officers don't like him very much. And as a matter of fact, there's a possibility that in one place a superior officer was actually trying to get him killed. So let's talk about Pike for a minute. He is ordered to navigate the rivers. His job is to start to explore the rivers that are inside this now United States holding. So he is sent specifically to look at the northern part of the Mississippi, follow the Mississippi River north, make sure the British aren't there anymore, and if they are, make sure the natives aren't trading with them. Let's make sure that the British abandon their lands like they said they would. So that's his whole job. He goes up and explains to every settlement that he meets that the British are no longer in charge of them anymore because they've been forced to trade with the British in the Ohio River Valley. But now the British are supposed to be leaving. So his job is to go up and tell these people, you no longer have to obey the British. You're no longer British. You're no longer subject to British soldiers. If the British tell you to do something, you don't have to do it. They're not in charge of you anymore. And just to make his point, in at least one place, at Leech Lake, he shot the British flag from the ground. He just opened fire and shot the British flag and then took it down and replaced it with an American flag. His intention was to, he traded medals that the natives had that were French and British medals. He exchanged them for American ones to try to make this point up and down the Mississippi River. We are who you trade with now. That was his whole job. And then he returned and was immediately sent back out again to find the sources of the Arkansas River and the Red River. Y'all know where the Red River is, right? Right, I would hope so. I would assume that you know that the Red River is here in this area. So he's sent into a part of America that's further south. If there's a possibility that he was being sent into a direction where his superior officer was pretty sure he'd be captured. So his general really didn't like him very much. He decided during his expedition to climb the highest peak he could find and do some, I'm sorry? This is Pike's Peak. He ordered his expedition up the highest peak he could find, which is actually, I think, the highest peak in America. Y'all can fact check me on that, but I'm pretty sure it is. He didn't make it all the way to the top, but his idea was if we can get up high enough, then we can map, because that was one of his specialties, was maps. He was not actually a cartographer, but he was like a map junkie. So he liked to make maps, and he had a pretty good idea of distance and stuff. He had kind of a natural gift for distance, so he should have been a cartographer, but he was a soldier. So he decided to climb up as high as he could so that he could get a good view all around. But he didn't make it to the top. It's hard to climb Pikes Peak, apparently. I'm sorry? Oh, well, yeah. Okay, so it was the highest peak in the United States for a long time. And then we let Alaska join.
Well, we bought them from Russia.
Yes. But we bought them as a territory. But now they're a state. So, yeah, anyway. Which is fine. We like Alaska. It's fine. Anyway, so as he's coming down off of Pikes Peak, he came down on the wrong side. And if you go back to this map, what is it that he's exploring the border of exactly? Anybody remember? I have to go back kind of a long way. Right, it's the southern border of the Louisiana Purchase. What's on the other side of that border? Right, but specifically, New Spain. It's owned by the Spanish. So right about here is where Pikes Peak is. It's right on this little bulge right here, kind of in this area. So he comes down off of the wrong side of these mountains and finds himself not in the Louisiana Purchase, in fact, but in Spain, in ground that's being held by Spain, which might have been his general's intention, to be honest, because if you track the river that he was ordered to track, if you track it, it goes into area that is definitely, he was ordered over here to find the mouth of the Arkansas and Red River, neither of which is inside the Louisiana Purchase. Okay, so it's possible that they totally expected him to get captured. So he comes down off of the wrong side and is captured by Spanish forces and taken to Santa Fe, which is where they have one of their northernmost judiciary urban areas is Santa Fe. None of these, of course, are states at the time. They're all part of New Spain, which hasn't divvied up into states yet. And the history of all of that is Mexican history. We have a professor whose job that is, and he's very, very good at it. So if you're interested in studying the history of Mexico, take Dr. Perry's classes. He offers like 4 of them. But at this time, most of the power was centralized around what you would call Mexico City. Some of it was Veracruz. Very little of it was this far north. So when he arrives, they don't really know what to do with him. They're not sure exactly what they should do with him, and it takes them a while to figure it out. And during that time, he says, hey, while I'm sitting here, y'all have any maps? Because I like maps. And they agree to let him look at whatever maps they have. Now, at this point, they've got the maps that have been provided them by Hernando de Soto. They've got the maps that have been provided him by Vasco da Gama. They've got explorers of their own who have made very intricate maps of this area, which the United States doesn't have. And he's sitting there in prison looking at them, committing them to memory, learning all about this territory that is basically New Spain. They finally make the decision. They take him down, and he has his trial down here in Veracruz. And then he is, basically they say, it's obvious to us that the United States was not committing an act of war by sending you on this expedition. You're just too dumb to know which side of the border you're on. Since you are so dumb, we are going to just escort you back to Louisiana, and please don't come back. And he said, okay. And that is exactly what they did. They marched him and his expedition through Texas to Louisiana. So the whole time he was marching through Texas, guess what he was doing? Memorizing maps. He was memorizing the area. He was asking lots of questions, and they were just perfectly happy answering whatever questions he had, everything that they wanted to know. Oh yes, this is where we had a mission settlement here, but it didn't go very well because of this. And this is what happened. And if you look in this area, that's mostly Plains Indians, and they're pretty vicious, but they don't stay all the time. So it would be possible, but we have a mission here. So this is the site of where this fell down, and this is the part where that failed. And here's really wonderful farming area, and we're very hopeful as the Spanish people that will work out for us. He was just a likable guy that they didn't mind sharing all this information with. So even though he didn't do what his expedition was supposed to do, which was to chart the mouth of a river, what he did come back with was detailed maps of this entire region, the governmental structure of New Spain, where all of its vulnerabilities were, and a detailed map of Texas. before he arrived back in Louisiana. So this is the...
Did they not think it was weird that he was like writing this all down?
No, they just thought he was a geeky fan of maps. I mean, they were just like, well, it's not like the United States of America is not going to take this territory away from Spain. The United States is fledgling. They're a tiny little disorganized group of people, and let's face it, the British haven't left yet. The chances of them being able to maintain their sovereignty are so slim that they're really not a threat to Spain. Right now, what Spain is worried about is France, because Spain and France are fighting on the ground in Europe. Napoleon is moving across the continent of Europe and taking it over. And for example, the Spanish royalty has actually fled to Brazil to get away, well, the Portuguese royalty. The Spanish royalty has basically signed a treaty handing Napoleon Spain, and the Portuguese royalty have fled to Brazil. So, you know, what with one thing and another, they have their own things that they're worried about. So they're definitely not worried about suddenly the US, which is all the way over here, buffered by territories that they do not have control over. So they're in these areas up here, and they've got all this area here that's basically natives who are in charge of this. And this urban area here that was controlled by the French, but the French have handed it over. Spain doesn't have anything that they're worried about in particular. They're not worried about America coming in. So yeah, they tell him all the information he could possibly want. And then he returns to Washington. He returns to the administration and says, here you go. And now suddenly America is in possession of all of these very detailed maps of this part of the northern United States, thanks to the Corps of Discovery, and this part of the southern United States, thanks to Zebulon Pike. So this is a great couple of years, because we're talking about from 1805 to 1808 that they managed to get all of this information. Now, there are other things going on, but I think that this is probably the most critical thing that's going on during this part of Jefferson's presidency, during his second term. Because, well, the US doesn't stay on the East Coast, does it? It expands west. So he doesn't do anything with this information. Jefferson doesn't do anything with this information because he still believes that he can't. Oh, here's Pike's Peak. All of this information was on slides. I'm sorry. I was more proactive than I realized. So there's Pike's Peak, 1806. He was in Pike's Peak. And here's his path back with some, you know, dates and facts and stuff. So that'll be on the PowerPoint. You can look at it later. So what a president who is a strict constitutionalist can do with this information is kind of, he can't negotiate for the purchase of Texas. He already feels bad about purchasing Louisiana. He can't send settlers because they would have to be developed by the states, and he believes in the states' right, but it's okay. His successors can deal with this situation. His successors can deal with all of these new findings, but his successors aren't going to be able to do that at first, because the fact is his successors have to deal with the fact that the British still haven't left, that the British are still in the Ohio River Valley. And now the British are trying to form their own alliances with the natives. They're forming their own alliances with people in this valley, and they're coming down out of the south to start to form alliances up here. So that's going to be what his successors get to do. All right, any questions about all of that stuff that we covered today?